Hello and welcome back to the Drawing Board. We're on episode number 2. My name is Mark.
I'm Andy.
I'm Dalton.
I want to welcome you guys back to the Drawing Board in the first episode, in case you missed it, but you can go back to watch it. But we talked about really kind of an introduction, talked about how we've made a lot of decisions during a time of crisis in the pandemic about digital ministry, and we took a look at Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47, which is some of the stuff that we're going to be discussing over the course of these the remainder of the series, the next 6 videos.
Yeah, definitely. And I think today, it'd be great for us to start right off the bat with the sacraments. Like, how do you do that digitally? It's a question I get asked quite a bit, actually, when I talk about doing digital ministry, especially a digital church. So yeah, how do we do the sacraments? What does that look like for a digital context?
Well, and what are the sacraments then? Let's define them first.
I love that.
Whoa, that's
an even better question.
Theology.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think we can talk a little bit about, and welcome to the hot seat, by the way. I think we can talk at least a little bit about what the sacraments are in our context. Now, I think that the important part here is, depending on your denomination and theological persuasion, this can be a very literal hang up for people, especially like if you're coming from a Roman Catholic background and you're watching this. We totally get how this can be a real hang up. And I think there's probably some other denominations as well where this can be a real thing. For us, when we're talking about the sacraments, at Lutz at least, we're talking about 2 primary sacraments that are practiced on with a high degree of regularity, which is the Lord's Supper and baptism. And so when most people ask us, how do you do the sacraments in an online context, usually the first thing that we get a question about is the Lord's Supper. How do you do the Lord's Supper inside of your context? What does that look like in your church? I actually had a friend literally message me yesterday or a couple days ago. He's in a seminary right now, and one of the things they brought up, there's sort of like an media course, which I really wish that my seminary degree had taught me, or at least my undergraduate had taught me a little bit about online space and media. Luckily, his is. And one of the things they were talking about in that was the sacraments, specifically the Lord's Supper. He's in a Southern Baptist school. How do we actually do that? What does that look like in the context of church? What does that look like in the context of online space? Now, for us at Lutz, and I think for a lot of churches, it really, the Lord's Supper is an outward expression of an inward conviction, right? That there's something that's important that's taking place there. But really what we're doing is we're remembering what it is that Jesus has done for us. And so in the spirit of that at Lutz, and I think in many digital contexts in terms of what we're doing in online space, it's important that we capture and embody this idea that the Lord's Supper is an act of remembrance. If you look at throughout the story of all the Israelites, we literally just read this morning in our online Bible study, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. We talk about discipleship as one of these key things in terms of our devotion to the apostles' teaching. On one of our future videos, we read a passage about whenever the Israelites crossed into the promised land for the first time. And as they did that, the river gets stopped up. And God literally tells them to go take one person from each tribe and get a stone from the river in front of the Ark of the Covenant and stack them up in a pile. And then afterwards, God tells them, here's the reason why you're doing that. Whenever your children come by this pile of stones and they ask you why, tell them the story of the time that God stopped up the Jordan River so that you could walk across on dry ground. In a very similar way, right, the Passover celebration was the same as that, right? It was this yearly celebration. And why did we celebrate Passover? God gives all of these instructions in the Torah about it. And in the end, he says, you're doing this so that when your children and grandchildren ask you around this really sacred celebration and meal, you can tell them about how God protected you from the angel of death whenever your ancestors were slaves in Egypt. And so in the same way, Jesus takes the Passover meal and he repurposes 2 pieces of that, right? The bread and the juice, or the bread and the wine. And he says, when you gather together, you want to do this in my name and remember me, which I think is really central to our understanding of what is the Lord's Supper and how are we doing it. So then how do we go about doing that in online space? I think there's a couple of ways that you can do it. I'm going to tell you how we do it. And then I'm going to also communicate with you the way one of our friends does it. Is another church at online space at Checkpoint. I think that they do some really creative stuff there as well. So for us, we say, listen, the elements that you gather are not the important part. It's the remembering that are important. Also, as the pastor, I don't believe that my hands touching those elements are the most important part of it. I don't think that my hands are sacred in the process at all. But I do think that we remember why it is that Jesus came. We remember his death, his resurrection, his sacrifice for us. And we do that in community. We do that with one another. And so at Lutz, every single month, at the first Wednesday night, we do our service on Wednesday night, our first service of the month, we take a few moments to remember what Jesus had done. In studio, wherever we're doing the Lord's Supper at, we have bread and juice, right? We don't do wine, but we do bread and juice. And we ask people at the beginning of service and the week before, we try to remind them, hey, when you come to service next week, if you are a believer in Jesus, you're a follower of Jesus, come and celebrate the Lord's Supper with us. We'd love to have you do that. Gather some elements. Sometimes people are coming, they're coming with water and they're coming with a Ritz cracker. Sometimes maybe someone's coming with a slice of pizza and a Mountain Dew. We don't really know, and we're not really sticklers over making sure that you have the correct elements. If we were, we would be doing wine. I've never been in a church that's done wine before. We've always had grape juice. We've always changed out what those substances were and weren't following Jesus' exact words in any church that I've ever been in, any of the churches that I grew up in anyway. And so it's important that we're remembering and we're doing it for the right reasons. That's our perspective. Now, I have friends in other people who are online space, and they've done some really cool and creative things. One of them was like a free subscription box, and so they would actually take the elements and put them in a box for a month, in a small box, and they would actually ship those things out to any person in their church that wanted one each month, and the pastor would lay hands on each of those boxes, pray over those things before they sent them out. In another online church, one of the things they do is they gather online on a call every Sunday night, and they actually gather together, they pray together, and they take the Lord's Supper together, even to the point that they used an AI bot to help design an app that literally is the only thing the app does is it's a button, and every person who's touching that app ticks, it shows a number at the top that ticks up 1 with every person while you're touching that button. And so to remember that they are together, they take the Lord's Supper, and as they do that, they each push the button on that app, on their phone or on their tablet, and it shows how many people are gathered together to take the Lord's Supper together, which is not something we've done, but it's a really creative and cool idea.
So good.
Yeah.
So good.
Okay, so you talked about the outward
expression of an inward conviction.
There we go. You
outward
nailed
expression.
It. So I think the biggest way that we as believers show that is baptism.
Yeah.
How do you do baptism in a digital context then? What's the modus operandi here? Yeah,
I think that is probably the one that people immediately, if you're a pastor, you're asking about that almost right away. I think it's this question. It's, there's a couple of others that are very standard questions, but one of the first one is, how do you do baptism? I'm going to explain how we do baptism at Lutz, but we also have friends who do it a little differently than us in digital space. And so I'm also going to talk about Cornerstone Church of Yuba City and Pastor Jason Poling there and the way that they've done that with their VR campus. Just to quickly clarify, there is a difference between what we are doing and metaverse ministry or virtual reality ministry. We're in a 2D space. VR is a 3D space with a headset. That is not the space that we're in. So it is done a little bit differently between us and what some of our friends are doing in VR space. But this is once again another situation where we're saying, hey, when it comes to baptism, I don't believe that my hands are sacred. I believe there's a couple of things that are really important in baptism, right? I believe that the dunking in water is an important aspect. You might be a sprinkler, maybe you're a, whatever. We do adult believer full immersion baptism at our church. You could probably extend the practices that we have to whatever your context is, whatever your affiliation, your denominational persuasion is. But for us, we're full immersion, adult believer baptism. And so when we have people who come to our church, who come to faith, one of the next steps for them is to be baptized. I just don't believe that it's my hands as the pastor that makes that baptism official. What is it that makes that baptism official? It is, for them, it's the confession of faith, right? And it's a public confession of faith to specifically their church family, the body of believers to which they belong. I believe that is central and important. And so that's how we practice it at Lutz. But how do we go about doing that? Well, we really do it in one of three ways. The first way, and this is the way that we probably primarily do it, is we actually help people find a local pastor to do their baptism. And so I can give an example of this. We had a mother and son in our church that wanted to be baptized. I'm in Pennsylvania. Pastor Andy is in Tampa. Pastor Dalton is in Wichita, Kansas. None of us were near Oregon, where they were in Salem. And so they wanted to be baptized. We ended up finding a local pastor out there, talked to a youth pastor. He was willing to do the baptisms. They actually went to a river in Salem, Oregon, and he baptized both of them, and it was recorded. And then they sent us the recording, and then we played that during a live service as a public declaration of faith to their church family. I had somebody there to baptize them. The next way that we do it is somebody who's a believer inside your family. We will train to do the baptism, and then we're usually on a Zoom call or something, and we screen record or record the call in order to celebrate that with our church family. And so a great example of that, we had a couple in Missouri, who was part of our church for a while, and his guy's wife came to faith through our church and wanted to be baptized. It was sort of like, I want to be baptized, and I want to be baptized now. Like, I don't want to wait. I want to be baptized now. And so they literally opened up their laptop next to their bathtub, drew a bath. She got in the bath. We walked through with her husband how to do that baptism. And then literally, he dunked her. My wife and I declared Father, Son, and Holy Spirit over her for her baptism over a Zoom call while recording it, and then prayed over them. And then we took that recording. We showed it to our entire church family. And then I would say, like, the third and final way that you can go about that, I think, is if they don't have anybody around them that is a believer. And we've had someone like this before as well, who, like, all of their friends were atheists. They didn't have anybody in their family or their context. And you'll get more and more of this in online space, especially as you experience people outside of your context and outside of your country, where it's far more common for people outside of your context and country to only have, let's say, all of my family and friends are Muslim, or all of my family and friends are atheists, or all my family and friends are Hindu. I don't have anybody. Then it's the process of finding somebody who is willing to do the dunking, and we declare Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and pray over them, but we're not physically there with them, and they have a non-believer who's doing the dunking. However, we've also seen contexts where that wasn't true. It's the heart. I want to be baptized, right? Some of our friends over at XP Church, which is an entirely online church in the gaming community as well, someone who came to faith, really wanted to be baptized. They had nobody to help them with that process. And so Pastor Matt of that church literally got on a call with them, recorded that call. They emptied out a garbage can, cleaned it out, filled it full of water, and dunked themselves inside of a trash can, which is amazing.
Dude,
it's just so powerful. And then lastly, I'll also point out this. We have people at our church that were baptized in virtual reality. You can check out Pastor Japo or Cornerstone Church of Yuba City, but they do VR baptisms. That's not where we are personally, but I love Pastor Japo, love I think his theology is rock solid. I deeply appreciate everything that they're doing in VR, but they hold virtual reality baptisms where you're baptized in avatar, making a public declaration of faith to your church family. I'm not always there. I still want people to I want them to get dunked physically, but I understand the point. And there are people in our church whose lives have been completely transformed, part of our small groups, part of it, and they're part of our church, but they were baptized in Pastor Jason's church at Cornerstone Church, Yuba City, baptized in VR. So I think there's a variety of ways that you can go about it as soon as you start thinking outside the box. I think the primary way for a lot of people is, although they're going to be doing that, contacting a local pastor, recording that baptism. And I would say the last way is sometimes we travel, like we have traveled. If there's someone who's within 4 or 5 or 6 hours, I'm hooking up. I'm doing a conference here in a couple of weeks in Indiana and talking about meeting up with one of our guys who's about 5 hours away from there in northern Indiana to come down and for me to do his baptism personally. And so we've done some of those. I've done baptisms with people on mission trips. They come on mission with us to Africa, and I'll baptize them, in Uganda with us. I've done that for my brother, done that for one of our elders at church. And so you just have to get creative and really think outside the box. Well, hey guys, thank you so much for tuning in and watching this video with us. Once again, if you haven't subscribed and checked out Exponential's YouTube yet, be sure to do that. Subscribe, hit the bell icon, because it'll help you find other great content. We have another 5 videos coming out on this channel talking about 5 more devotions of the early church and how we can live those things out biblically inside of digital space. But there's also really great content from a lot of the other Exponential Next content partners and directors that are here on YouTube and will be coming out throughout the course of 2025. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. We're going to see you back in the next video where Pastor Dalton is going to be in the hot seat.
Go.
Yeah.
Let's
We're going to be
go.
talking about how we do community online, which that's a big one. A lot of people don't know if it's possible.
It's quite huge.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that one.
We'll see.
Yeah, so tune in for the next video. We're going to be talking about online community.